Madam President, let me begin by saying that I am proudly pro-Second Amendment. I believe in a God-given right for law-abiding Americans to keep and bear arms. And the Second Amendment has given millions of Americans the right to defend their spouse, their family, their children, their home. But if you consider yourself a supporter of the Second Amendment, you absolutely want to do something about Uvalde, to do something about murders related to domestic violence, to do something about straw purchases, to do something about teen suicide by gun. You cannot be pro-Second Amendment unless you care deeply about these issues. That's why we have targeted legislation, the Safer Communities Act, that addresses specific problems that have led to mass shootings by restricting access for someone who should not have a weapon, but also by providing additional mental health resources and by hardening schools. This legislation accomplishes these goals without infringing upon a law-abiding citizen's Second Amendment right. And let me repeat that, because there's been confusion in speeches from this floor. There's been internet exploding. There's rumors afloat that somehow this infringes upon the law-abiding citizen's right to keep and bear arms. That is absolutely false, and if anyone says so, they are misleading the American people. Madam President, this doesn't do any of that. Madam President, what this legislation says, that unless you are adjudicated, now adjudicated is a $5 word that means you go before a judge, and the judge looks at the evidence, and under this bill, if a state puts this into law, then they've got to follow due process, which says that the person who may lose their Second Amendment right has the right to an attorney, a higher standard for the evidence that must be presented, that person has their day in court. This was the gold standard that the National Rifle Association always advocated for, as if we were going to take Second Amendment rights from someone who should not have them. And this bill has that gold standard. Now, I've had a couple of town halls just to find out what folks back in Louisiana were thinking about all this. Frankly, they're talking about inflation and the price of the pump as much as they're talking about this. But I got a message. They think that we can protect Second Amendment rights and do something about a tragedy such as Uvalde. But let me give you some of the comments, because it shows you the confusion and it shows you the concerns and it shows you where the American people are. Chris asked, when he dies, can he pass his gun to his child if his child is law-abiding? Absolutely. That is preserved. We don't touch that. And by golly, Chris should be able to do so. We were asked by Tyler if this raises the age of the ability to purchase a weapon from 18 to 21. It does not. It doesn't touch that, although apparently Tyler had been told that was the case. I was asked about RJ, about keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. And I say, man, we got something in there, RJ, that actually addresses that. I heard from two people who said we should forbid the purchase of so-called assault weapons. And I heard from one guy who said, man, I live in a tough section of town, and if somebody invades my house, I don't want it to be a fair fight. So I've heard on all sides of these arguments as to what. But the message I got, we can protect Second Amendment rights, but still do something about Uvalde. Now, it's not just Uvalde. There's other types of gun violence in our society. At least four. This bill addresses at least four. There's the domestic violence. There is the suicide by the child. There's the gangster buying a gun to shoot people up, and then there's the rampage shooting. Let's talk about each of those. When it comes to the domestic violence, a guy beats up his girlfriend. He comes back with a weapon and shoots her a month later. It happens too much. I talked to my police chief, Murphy Paul, in Baton Rouge, and he tells me that domestic violence and domestic murder spiked under the pandemic. This bill does something about it. I asked people who oppose this bill, what about domestic violence, man? What about that woman who's threatened? Shouldn't we do something for her safety? This bill does something for her safety and quite likely for her children's safety and quite likely prevents a suicide by the troubled man who goes there in the first place. Let's talk about crime, gangsters, straw purchases. Boyfriend's got a felony, can't buy a weapon, the girlfriend buys him one and slips it to him. It's against the law now, but it happens all the time. We strengthened, RJ, if you're watching on C-SPAN, man, I'm channeling you. Because we took the provision RJ said we should do, and we increased the penalties for that person who buys a weapon merely to pass it to another. To hopefully throw her in prison for as much as 10 years if she contributes to a murder by buying a gun for someone who goes out and commits that murder. We talk about rampage shooting. You know what's much more common? The teenager shooting himself. We stopped that. Oh, they can still steal a weapon if they want to, but there is $12 billion in some form or another for mental health services. We do our best to reach that child. And by the way, suicide, rampage shooting is the worst. Then comes suicide. Then comes the addiction. I'm a doctor. I've seen this stuff. And after the addiction just becomes the person who's emotionally troubled. We are putting in mental health services that can address it all. With money for a 988 line so that if somebody is just like, oh my gosh, I'm desperate, they have somebody to call. Personally, I'd like to have an app. I'd like to have, I'm a troubled teenager app, and I need somebody to talk to. They're doing this in Utah, and they tell me that the investment has been tremendous. I think they told me they prevent a suicide a week. That's off the top of my head. Call it a suicide every 2 weeks. That's a powerful intervention. This bill has that capability. And lastly, there is the information regarding the rampage shooting, Uvalde. Somebody told me, I searched on the internet. I didn't see that this guy was troubled. That's precisely the point. This man's troubled, but he's less than 18. Those records are sealed. You can't get to them. So even though every indication was that this young troubled man would have had a reason not to be able to purchase a weapon, it's sealed. He turns 18, he's a clean guy. And he goes out and buys 2 assault weapons and starts planning his assault. If you're pro-Second Amendment, by golly, you want to stop that. And what this bill does is it allows the court to look into that and say, oh, he's clean, that's okay, or no, he's troubled. And we need a little extra time to look at this. By the way, that's a provision that has been distorted and twisted to imply that law-abiding 18 to 21-year-olds would not be able to purchase a weapon. If you're a law-abiding, you can still purchase that weapon if you're 18. But if not, or if there's another indication, then the background check has a chance to look at it. And if you're pro-Second Amendment, by golly, I'll say it one more time, you should applaud that provision. Now, let's do a couple other things. Right now, a Mexican cartel can smuggle weapons to Mexico to shoot people up. We make that illegal. You would think it already would be, but it's not. How can somebody be against that? Criminalizing cartels from smuggling weapons to Mexico. And somehow we're infringing upon Second Amendment rights of the cartels? My gosh, I wish we'd do worse to them. We increase penalties for illegal gun traffickers, criminal gun increases. We are doing something about criminals. But, have I said it yet? We preserve the Second Amendment rights for the law-abiding. Now, I'm a gastroenterologist, so I didn't know anything about due process except as a term. But speaking to John Cornyn, who's done a fantastic job, and the other attorneys, I've learned a little bit about due process, Madam President. And by the way, when somebody calls me up and they say they heard something on the internet, I said, why don't you read the bill? It's 80 pages. Read the bill. And on page 33, you're going to read about due process. It says that any state red flag law, we don't encourage those red flag laws, but if the state decides to do one and they want federal dollars, they now got to obey these rules. And the rules say it must include, at a minimum, due process rights that prevent any violation or infringement on the Constitution of the United States. If you're pro-Second Amendment, you should like that. A state can actually have a red flag law right now and not have that in there. But under this bill, by golly, they had better. How can anyone object to that? The bill also ensures that no state can sidestep due process. It strengthens the citizens' right to due process. It increases the evidentiary bar. It can't be hearsay, can't be a social worker, oh, I'm a little nervous. It's got to be before a judge, and it's got to have evidence, and the person losing their right has got, or maybe losing their right, has the ability to have an attorney with them. Now, no offense to my people on the other side of the aisle, but if a liberal state puts forth a law that has poor due process, they won't get federal dollars. And that should be something we are proud about. Now, my state doesn't have a red flag law. This bill does not require, mandate, or incentivize that Louisiana develop a red flag law. But you know, my state does get money for drug courts, for enforcing restraint orders. So the fellow who's not supposed to go near his wife because they're afraid he'll beat her up again, the police have more resources in order to prevent that. Who can be against that? That's in this bill. By the way, our legislation also hardens schools. There's money for the Stop School Violence School Safety Program, including school resource officers and school hardening. There's additional funding for mental health resources, drug and violence prevention, mentoring, crisis intervention, high-quality training for school personnel on suicide prevention and human trafficking. How can someone be against that? This is a solution. Now, by the way, we have a serious problem in mental health. In my career, I have been privileged to work with Senator Murphy and others on solutions for mental health. There's increased dollars for Medicaid, including telehealth services for schools that might be in a rural area, otherwise without a mental health professional around. It expands mental health services under Medicaid. School-based mental health services, all expanded. It reauthorizes the Pediatric Mental Health Care Access Program. It gives pediatric providers extra training in mental health, and I could go on. Now, there's still a lot of misinformation out there, but I would say if you don't know what's in the bill, it's online, pick it up and read it. But if you're pro-Second Amendment, you should be for this bill. We can protect Second Amendment rights. We can make an impact on teen suicide, upon domestic abuse, upon straw purchases landing guns in the hands of criminals, and upon rampage shooting. And we can do that while protecting the Second Amendment. That's what I'm hearing from the American people. That's what this bill does. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.